Today we're going to tackle a bit of social science. By that, I mean that we're going to take a look at a specific section of society and its social interactions, which are largely fueled by social media, and how they affected the discussion on some very important topics within the scientific world. I'm sure that you can take your pick of any number of topics, and you're probably going to know exactly what I'm talking about here. We're talking about misinformation and disinformation. And yes, those are, in fact, two different things. A quote often attributed to Voltaire should serve as a good starting point for us here. If you wish to converse with me, first define your terms. Typically, correcting terminology seems a bit pedantic in conversation, but the truth of the matter is that having an agreed upon definition is something that is critical to discussions such as these. In a lot of cases, you won't have to worry about defining your terms since the meanings are inherently agreed upon. A pencil is a pencil, scissors are scissors, and a fish is a social construct. You can learn more about that here. But when we start to get into terms that don't have physical representations that you can point to, they start to have far less concrete definitions to the average person. So with things like social constructs, unless you watched my video or you happen to take the time to learn about it, you might be hard-pressed to have a definition for it. Misinformation and disinformation share some commonalities within their definition, as both are false, misleading, or inaccurate information. The major distinction between the two comes from intent. Misinformation typically arises from incomplete or faulty sources of information. In some cases, they can be simply seen as making a mistake or misspeaking. A lot of the science communicators that you watch are not immune to spreading misinformation. I know that I try to simplify my scripts as much as I can in order to make the topics understandable to the widest audience, but that often inadvertently causes misinformation through omission. In most circumstances, its impact is negligible at best. Disinformation, on the other hand, is deliberately false and usually used to further a specified agenda. It's most commonly seen within propaganda, although that's not to say that all propaganda is inherently false. There are examples of disinformation campaigns coming about by groups that are attempting to raise awareness about disinformation campaigns. One group of people just want to show how ridiculous conspiracy theories are, and then all of a sudden a large group of the population stops believing that birds are real. Seeing as how I'm not a scientist, an archaeologist, a psychologist, or any other kind of professional that has an ist at the end of their title, I want you to take everything that I say with the largest grain of salt, and to confirm the veracity of my own claims and information that I spread. That's not something that people who are engaged in spreading misinformation or disinformation will actually say to you. Usually they'll make claims of, it's self-evident, or I don't need to research to tell me that it's true, or even, I did my own research. First of all, Uncle Jimmy, you did not research it at all. You read one article that was 30 pages deep on Google and confirmed your own positions, and then ignored the 29 other pages that included research papers, articles, and direct video statements by nearly every scientist within the field, which said you're wrong. Contrary to what some people may say, science isn't inherently dogmatic. Any scientific claim is subject to scrutiny, and every field of research relies on that scrutiny in order to verify the information presented. I'm sure that most people are just assuming that I'm talking about the peer review process, but there's more to it than that. In my last video, I talked about the double slit experiment, which was first performed in the early 1800s. If science was full of dogmatic beliefs, then all further research into the experiment and subsequent quantum mechanics would never have happened in the early to mid-1900s. Scientific consensus is the majority opinion of scientists within a given field, but it's open to the same scrutiny and review that is critical to the scientific process and fuels further discoveries that we expect from it. We are meant to ask questions about the things that we know and how we know them. But that shouldn't be taken to mean that every question is valid. I want to play a little game with you. You're probably familiar with a number of conspiracy theories that range from the plausible to the ridiculous. Grab the first one that comes to your mind and play along with me. The way that you play along is by answering the few questions that I provide as we go through this next part of the script. Every conspiracy theory purports that it's providing an explanation for something, usually in a way that is contradictory to scientific or historical consensus. And they always end up connecting back to some organization or group. But this means that they're also asking a question. You can't give an explanation if there never was a question to be asked in the first place. So, what is the question that the conspiracy theory is attempting to answer? And why are they asking that question? See, the issue with the conspiracy theories isn't that they are asking questions. As I said earlier, asking questions is a necessary part to the scientific process. It's why they're asking the question that's more important. In the vast majority of them, they aren't asking the question to find an answer, but rather to give an answer that suits them. They are, by their very nature, disinformation campaigns, and the only use that they provide is the further spread of their disinformation. So to conclude our little game, is it valid for them to ask a question if they aren't really seeking an answer? We live in a very interesting time in the world. Almost all the information and collective knowledge of humankind is available in your hand or at the stroke of a key. Be it a Google search, a YouTube video by some guy who's obsessed with otters, or the wiretap that you paid to put into your house. Hey Alexa, what's a good name for otters? If that worked, I will not apologize for it. You have a near infinite number of ways to access just about anything that you want to know. But even with the unprecedented amount of access that we have, there's a large number of people who only ever receive theirs from social media platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. One of these things may seem out of place to you. Social media is simply websites and applications that enable users to create and share content or allow them to participate in social networking. So platforms like YouTube and Twitch are social media just like Facebook, Twitter, and every message board or forum like Reddit, 4chan, or Tumblr. And we all should be at least vaguely aware of how exactly these platforms channel that information to you. Algorithms, join groups, and the people that you follow on them are used to spread content from the furthest reaches of the platform and bring them to you. If you're not already subscribed to this channel, that's almost certainly how this video got in front of you. That or someone really needed you to hear the information in it because you've already fallen down into the rabbit hole and are subject to misinformation and disinformation. All of that should serve sufficiently as me defining my terms for this conversation, and hopefully it already started to illuminate some of the issues that are swimming at the core of science misinformation, disinformation, and denial. A consensus is reached within the scientific community for a specific field through research, experimentation, and data analysis. A group or number of groups, in the form of corporations, political organizations, etc., take issue with the consensus because it somehow negatively affects them, and so they take action utilizing social media and public figures to discredit that consensus or raise questions in opposition to it in an active disinformation campaign. That disinformation spreads through social media by the closed groups and algorithms, creating echo chambers where that information is reinforced. It then further spreads by those who believe it, creating misinformation that spreads to more people in a negative feedback loop. When the scientific community attempts to actively correct against that misinformation, the groups of conspiracy theorists and those actively participating in the disinformation campaign resist and reinforce the conspiratorial thinking of those who believe the misinformation. This is how all disinformation campaigns work and how misinformation spreads throughout the population. Our ability to catch it really needs to start about here, at the point where the initial questions in opposition to the scientific data begin. Are the questions that are being asked in response to that data part of the peer review process, or are they being asked in order to discredit the consensus? Are the claims being made valid, or are they only serving to stall out the conversation about the consensus? We need to be able to parse through the information and determine which side is providing hard scientific information and which side is providing little to no information in opposition. This can lead us into questions about access to scientific studies and research, along with teaching us better ways to understand it at lower levels of education, as most of it is convoluted to find in the first place and locked behind paywalls while being difficult to read by most layfolk. Trust me when I say that nearly every video I have ever made about science would be 1,000 times easier to make if I could just freely and quickly access those studies about prehistoric otters. To most people, conversations about scientific misinformation and denial may almost seem silly. Everyone is entitled to their own opinions, and these are just disagreements between ideas with no real bearing on the world around us. Right? I have to ask if that's really the case. Misinformation and the subsequent science denial that comes along with it have very real and apparent impacts. For the sake of brevity, I'm only going to focus on one of the many instances of disinformation. If I didn't do that, we'd probably end up being here for years. There's just that many of them, and they all have their intricacies. I've mentioned climate change a number of times on the channel, usually when talking about mass extinctions in the past. But I've only ever really talked about anthropogenic climate change once. That's just a big word that means human-centric or human-caused. In most circumstances that you find people talking about it, they are simply using climate change because it's easier to say. But climate change is an extremely clinical term. Climate change refers to changes within global climate over time. This is different from weather, which is tied to specific geographical locations. I'm not going to fault you for not knowing the difference, as it's usually not important to most people in their day-to-day lives. I will, however, fault you if you're talking about it as if you have expert knowledge in the field and you still make that mistake. We didn't always call what's going on right now climate change. As recently as the early 2000s, it was referred to as global warming. I'm not going to dive in the political reasons as to why that change happened, but if you want to hear about it, then I recommend checking out Knowing Better's video on it. I'll have that link down in the description, along with a number of other videos talking about similar subjects. While climate change is a more accurate description of what's happening, the reason we didn't call it this is because, one, we needed to separate it out from the process that occurred in the past, as they don't share the same commonalities other than the change in climate. And number two is because it's a less scary term and people are less likely to actually act whenever they aren't scared of something that they rightfully should be. To be short and overly simplify what anthropogenic climate change is, it's the rapid change in global climate caused by the emissions of greenhouse gases by humans. Those greenhouse gases come from primarily burning fossil fuels, but they can also come from a number of other sources. Production of cattle and other livestock happens to be one of the next largest sources. There are two major real-world impacts from anthropogenic climate change that I'm going to focus on because they are the most immediate that we can notice and probably have the largest effect on human society. Also, they happen to be extremely interconnected in ways that may not be readily apparent. Those are a reduction in biodiversity and the rising sea levels. Let's start with the latter. As the ocean levels rise, we will see the destruction of coastline, cities, and island nations. Within the next 40 years, it's expected that places like Miami-Dade County in Florida will be near completely underwater. For places like Venice, Italy, and the country of Denmark, that might be an optimistic number. This loss of habitable land creates a refugee crisis. If people in Texas are already annoyed by the people in California coming here, imagine what will happen when all the other coastal cities, as well as the entire eastern seaboard of America, have to flood into the state because it's got more open land than anywhere else in the country. That influx of people will happen all around the world because of shortages in the supply chain, specifically in the food supply chain. Why? Because all the water that made the oceans rise is fresh water. Not to go too deep, fresh water disrupts the natural cycles of the ocean currents, and places like England can't exist in a habitable climate without them. The ecological systems that usually keep the breadbaskets of the world working collapse, reducing food production globally along with the types of food that can be produced. A loss in biodiversity doesn't just refer to the wild animals that live on this planet. It also includes every domesticated crop and animal that we use to sustain human society. This is the real world cost of misinformation about climate change. And we are already starting to see the effects of prolonging the debate about if it's even real or not because of the misinformation. The water shortages occurring right now in California, Arizona, Nevada, and Colorado aren't just one-off droughts. They've been happening over decades with a clear trend of less and less water being available to them. This is the major reason that the Department of Defense has labeled climate change as an existential threat to national security. For those of you who kept watching expecting me to now go on into explaining how we fight against misinformation and disinformation, I may end up disappointing you. The best way to fight them is to educate people long before they ever fall into them by encouraging critical thinking skills and how to properly evaluate information. But once someone has fallen into misinformation and disinformation, it's rather hard to convince them that that's where they are with educating on the subject and disproving their theory. You're not going to convince them that they're wrong. The only thing that will is themselves. It's much like religion. You're not going to convert someone who isn't having a crisis of faith. Debunking conspiracy theories and actively fighting against disinformation is an important thing to do. The primary reason to do so is to help prevent those who haven't already fallen into the rabbit hole from taking that dive in. It's incredibly fun to do. But for the reasons stated earlier, that's not going to stop people who believe in them from spreading the disinformation. At this point, we have to realistically focus on how we're going to mitigate the damage done by misinformation. Easier said than done, considering that people who have the power to do so are elected officials actively participating in them. I came into this video hoping to improve your ability to actively recognize misinformation and disinformation when it's provided to you. But as I've been writing the script out, I've taken a look back on conversations that I've had with family members and friends who I would consider capable of recognizing these things. And I'm starting to think that's not going to be enough. If you're not one for political conversations, now might be the time to tune out. But I do encourage you to stick around, not only because I need the watch time to make the algorithm decide to send this video out to as many people as possible, but because hopefully it will help you realize that the issues of scientific misinformation and disinformation are affected by the wider machinations of society as a whole. With almost no exceptions, there isn't much on this world that isn't subject to politics. I briefly mentioned propaganda when talking about the differences between misinformation and disinformation. It's properly defined as information, especially of a biased or misleading nature, used to promote or publicize a particular political cause or point of view. You see it everywhere, even if you don't recognize it. Just about every movie, song, and book is a form of propaganda. Even all the videos that I've made can be considered as such. It functions to either convince you of a position or to reinforce the ones that you already have. This definition inherently makes disinformation propagandistic in nature. All sides of the political spectrum use disinformation and propaganda to influence the way that you think. And since I've already blown the hinges off of this video in having any kind of neutrality by mentioning the words politics, I might as well dive right into it. Honestly, I probably actually did that with the first line of this video, but I digress. Terms like critical race theory, climate change, assault rifle, capitalism, and socialism all have concrete definitions that you can look up for yourselves. Maybe not assault rifle, but you do get the picture. If I asked you to define them off the top of your heads, though, you're almost certainly going to give me a definition that is intrinsically linked to the political conversations around them. For example, critical race theory is a purely academic teaching that is used to describe the functions of law and their systemic racial biases. It's only taught in the collegiate level, and even then, it's only taught in very specific fields. You wouldn't have ever heard of it if you didn't go to law school or try to get a degree in sociology. But due to disinformation campaigns and propaganda, there's a significant portion of the country that is convinced that it's being taught to little Timmy in kindergarten in the form of United States history. This is the purpose of political disinformation campaigns, to alter the common definitions of words that you should be able to freely find and to limit your ability to critically think about the topics that those new definitions are being used in. If you're familiar with George Orwell's book 1984, you'd recognize this as newspeak. The issues get compounded by the fact that our own psychology works against us to reinforce the positions that we already believe. Confirmation bias is probably a term that you're familiar with and shouldn't really need any definition, but it's the tendency to interpret new evidence as confirmation of one's existing beliefs or theory. When presented with the evidence of anthropogenic climate change, your confirmation bias may just well tell you that it's further proof that the climate has always changed in the past and that this shouldn't be taken to mean that something new or different is happening, even if the overwhelming data says that it's accelerated far beyond the bounds of historical examples and that rates that haven't been seen before, even in cases of rapid climate change. This is an incredibly simple thing to understand. Basically, once you believe something about a specific topic, anytime you hear new information about it, you're going to subconsciously attempt to rationalize it to either fit your previous belief or outright dismiss it. If we're going to realistically tackle the issues of misinformation and disinformation in science, we're going to have to look at not only the source of it, but the underlying reasons of how it spreads in the first place. People don't fall down these rabbit holes simply because they provide compelling information. Flat Earth theories wouldn't be so pervasive if that were the case. The reason that simply educating someone on how to better recognize disinformation and debunking the theories isn't enough because it's intrinsically linked to a person's political and cognitive biases. And that's also the reason that those campaigns work so well. The best kind of propaganda is the one you don't recognize. That's propaganda. You're going to notice that as I went through this video, I really didn't tackle as to one side or the other for the political spectrum. And that's largely because it doesn't matter. Although if you wanted to know, there's only one side that's actively participating in it right now. I can tell you, they're the loudest group. Ideally, once we get a handle on the current disinformation that is going out and about, it's going to take a lot in order for us to fix the issues that have come about from it. But I remain hopeful that once we do actually get there, that we'll be able to just sail on like nothing happened. That's incredibly optimistic and probably not going to happen anytime soon. But I have hope. Anyways, this video ballooned far, far longer than I ever wanted it to. That may be a good thing, maybe a bad thing, I don't know, we'll find out later. But if you enjoyed this, go ahead and hit the subscribe button and help me out. Share this with anyone that you may know that happens to have fallen down that rabbit hole, or someone you might suspect is on the verge of doing so. It may help them, it may not, but we can remain optimistic together. Anyways, I'll see you next time.